Okay, so it's on record, always on record now. So whatever we say, it will go down in history.
Excellent.
Okay, doing this great. So everybody make a nice smile. This is for the promotion of STR.
Is this some sort of like, this from like the Hunger Games or something?
Peace and prosperity.
Oh God. Leo, that sounds also a bit like Star Trek, no?
It is Star Trek.
David, you can put your hands off. David froze. So, hi, welcome to this workshop, STR Stronger Together Virtual PDW on Formal Modeling in Management Research. My name is Liyue Yan. I'm one of your hosts today. What I'm gonna do here right now is to make a very quick introduction and go right into this agenda. We have a great panel today. We have 8 panelists who have experience with modeling. We have Aseem from Minnesota, Leonardo Kluppel from Ohio State, Jiao from Minnesota, Feng from HBS, Richard Makadok from Purdue, Elena Plaksenkova from Ohio State, who is also our main organizer, and David Gaddis from University of Florida, and Feng from HBS. We would like to give special thanks to Samina, Aseem, Jiao, Paulo, Michael Libling, and all the great people who put together the STR Stronger Together initiative and the STR leadership team. Only because of them, we have this opportunity to host this workshop. First, what are formal models? Here our definition is mathematical representations of the phenomenon of interest wherein the researchers outlines assumptions and definitions with mathematical statements and then use mathematical proofs to derive and validate propositions. Just to be clear, this definition, it refers to analytical models instead of simulation computational models. However, they have big overlaps and share some similar features. And some of our panelists have experience with both. While today's focus is on analytical models, discussion can be extended to computational models as well. So why are we having this workshop? Formal modeling is becoming more common and accepted in management research. It has been used to study a variety of research questions in for both theoretical and empirical work. This is also reflected in our panel. We have both theoretical modelers and empiricists. And this graph shows the trend. It shows the total number of management papers in the top 6 management journals with keywords formal model or game theoretical model in the title or abstract. And this is a conservative estimation. So the trend is clear. However, it is still considered, the formal models they are still considered to be underused in our own field. Because there is still some ambiguity and a lack of community, we decided to have a workshop. So Elena and I did this workshop last year on AOM and received some positive feedback, so we decided to do it again. The goal for today is to introduce the why and how on formal modeling for management research. If you're familiar with modeling, I see some of our audience are experienced modelers. We still hope to present you diverse perspectives from our panelists and stimulate some good conversations. Now, agenda. So we will first have a 90-minute panel session where some panelists give presentations. Each talk is 10 minutes. First, we will have Rich to talk about formal models' benefits, cost, tips, followed by Feng's talk on how they can contribute to strategy research. Then we will have our first 5-minute Q&A session. We ask you to leave your question in the chat window. The questions themselves can be for all panelists, not just limited to the presenters. Elena and I, we will moderate the Q&A session. And we ask you try to keep the question relatively short. We will leave the longer question for the last Q&A. After that, we will have more hands-on topics by Elena and David, then a second Q&A. Last, Hong and Aseem will talk about using models for empirical work and future avenues. And the last Q&A will be 10 minutes long. After that, we will conclude and transit into the breakout room for the second session, the breakout session. Participants who have registered for the roundtable, which is also the breakout session, needs to stay, and we will assign you to the different rooms. And that's our introduction. Right now, I'm just gonna hand the control. I'm gonna stop share and hand the control to Rich. And Rich, I will send you a reminder when there is 2 minutes left through the private chat tab. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you. Okay, can everyone see my screen that I'm sharing? Give me a nod or a thumbs up. Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So first of all, thanks very much to Elena and Liyue for organizing this, and to all the good folks at the STR division for helping us put it on. So I'm going to be, for everyone's convenience, I have posted a PDF version of my slides, as well as some other documents that I'm going to refer to during my talk. I've posted them in a cloud folder, and I am now putting in the chat window a web link to that cloud folder where you can download those documents. Okay, so I think that my role in this panel is to provide the gray hair. I have some experience doing this, so please indulge me for a brief 30-second ego trip, and then I'll come back to earth after that. So over the past 20 years, I've published a total of 9 formal theory papers in top-tier management journals. 1 of them in AMR, 2 of them in management science, 6 of them in SMJ, and I'm not stopping either. I've got 5 more formal theory papers at some stage of the review process. So not too many people have published more formal theory papers in top-tier management journals, maybe a few, but not too many. I've heard it said, particularly one of the papers that's in the folders that I just posted is this introduction to the Adner et al. Special topic forum in AMR, special issue. And in that introduction, they say basically that formal theory is about creating precision, rigor, and having an audit trail on the logic of theory. And I gather that some of the panelists here today will make a similar argument. But I'm going to make although I have only the greatest respect for Ron and Laszlo and Mike and Olav, who wrote that introduction, I'm going to say that they've missed some of the point. I think that this argument about precision and rigor is kind of a red herring, or at least a sideshow. Yes, it's definitely true that formal modeling does add transparency and rigor, but that is not its main benefit. If the only benefit of formal modeling were simply about improving transparency and rigor, then I suspect it would not have achieved much influence at all. Formal modeling, like any research tool or method, is best judged according to the degree of insight, not the degree of precision that it brings to the field. I can't think of any empirical researcher on the empirical side who has, who has gained fame merely by finding techniques to reduce the amount of noise in the estimate of a regression equation or a regression parameter that has already been subjected to numerous previous studies. Only if that improved estimation technique generates results that are dramatically different from previous results or from expected results would the improved precision of the estimate matter much. So that is only if the improved precision added new valuable and new insights. In that case, it would really be the insight that mattered, not the precision. And I think it's a similar sort of thing for theoretical work. Just as the impact of empirical work is proportionate to its degree of new insight, so too is it that the impact of theoretical work is also proportionate to its degree of new insight, not to its degree of precision or rigor. And there have been excruciatingly unsophisticated empirical methods. For example, Ned Bowman's highly influential papers on the risk-return paradox and risk-seeking by troubled firms that provide, a great example to this point, that it's not the sophistication of the empirical methods that matters. Okay. So the relevant question here is, where, if anywhere, can formal modeling generate valuable new insights? If so, where and how? I'm aware of a few ways in which formal modeling can help a theorist generate new insights. Now, I would never say that formal modeling is absolutely necessary to generating any particular insight, nor would I ever say that any particular insight could not be generated through verbal theorizing. However, there are some kinds of theoretical insights that are just easier to see with the aid of a formal model. By analogy, you can, in principle, chop down any tree with an axe. But there are some trees for which you would really much rather have a chainsaw as a matter of convenience. I once heard an obstetrician convince an expectant mother to accept an epidural anesthetic by saying that it's just a modern convenience, like air conditioning in the summer. You can certainly survive without these modern conveniences, but why not use them if they're readily available? That's roughly how I think about formal modeling. It's a helpful modern convenience that can sometimes help us to see new insights. So one of the first ways in which formal modeling can help us generate new insights is decomposing an effect into separate parts that may sometimes oppose each other, such as direct and indirect effects, or intended and unintended effects. For example, in economics, the change in the price of a good, the effect of a change in the price of a good on the quantity of that good demanded is decomposed into two separate parts. There's a substitution effect, which you can think of as a fairly direct effect, and there is an income effect, which you can think of as a somewhat indirect effect. And in most cases, what economists call normal goods, these two components of the effect move in the same direction, but sometimes they move in opposite directions. What economists call Giffen goods. In some cases, with a Giffen good, the indirect effect can actually overwhelm the direct effect and cause the effect to be reversed. So with a Giffen good, we don't have demand that is always downward sloping. It may have some regions where it's upward sloping. So I imagine that coming to that kind of insight would be a lot harder without the aid of a formal model. Another example of this from the strategy literature is my 2013 SMJ article with David Ross, who you'll be hearing from later in this session, where we decompose the effect of product differentiation into two separate parts, a competitive advantage effect and a rivalry restraint effect. Sometimes these two parts move in the same direction, sometimes in opposite directions, and the math in our model helps us to kind of clarify when each part is strengthened or weakened, when they oppose each other, and when one might overwhelm the other. Could these insights have been generated by verbal theory? I guess in principle they could, but it certainly would have been a lot harder, and it certainly would have been impossible for me to do personally. Okay, so another way that formal modeling can generate new insights is through studying interaction effects. It may be relatively easy to envision the main effect, that X affects Y, but it can be trickier to envision the interaction effects of how Z influences the strength of the effect of X on Y. Is the effect of X on Y dampened when Z increases, or is it amplified when Z increases? Is it undermined, or is it reinforced when Z increases? So a formal model can be quite helpful in answering such questions about interaction effects. Without a formal model, it can be difficult to develop a clear, unambiguous argument for such interaction effects to be either positive or negative. Indeed, without a formal model, a theorist might never have even thought of the possibility that Z could have an effect on the relationship between X and Y. But such unanticipated interactions may just naturally drop out of a formal model even without looking for them. So in this regard, a formal model may suggest new insights that the theorist really hadn't previously considered. So another example from economics is the basic agency theoretic model in economics, such as Grossman and Hart's 1983 Econometrica paper. It's about the main effect of performance-based incentives motivating behavior from an agent that's more consistent with the principal's agent. But how is this main effect altered when the agents assigned tasks differ in their, when the tasks assigned to an agent differ in their measurability? So a formal model may not be absolutely required to answer this question, but Holmstrom and Milgram's 1991 formal model sure helps a lot. Likewise, in the strategy field, I've used a formal model pretty frequently to hypothesize about the main effects on profit that would have been difficult, at least difficult for me, to see without a formal model. Okay, then a third way that formal modeling helps is through articulating boundary conditions. So in extreme cases, if an interaction effect is particularly severe, it can overwhelm the main effect, in which case it can impose a boundary condition, right? So it can kind of bring to light the hidden assumptions of old-fashioned verbal models in this way. So in economics, right, there's many examples of this. For example, Bertrand's response to Cournot's oligopoly model, right, that shows, you know, under Bertrand's assumptions, two firms can be sufficient to completely eliminate all the profit from the industry if their behavior toward each other is sufficiently aggressive. So that provides kind of a boundary condition. Okay, I'm going to move on quickly since I've only got less than a minute left. So we're kind of in the right place at the right time for this. There's, like with any tool, there's diminishing marginal returns to its use. You know, after a century, formal modeling is somewhat overused in economics and finance, but it's underused in strategy. There's still plenty of low-hanging fruit to be taken care of. I want to comment a little bit about how to present formal models to a non-technical management audience, because that's most of what we'll be doing. So, you know, this is a lovely little note that I found somewhere on the web. And the point is, this person took 1 + 1 = 2 and complicated it mathematically. So you have this first equation, 1 + 1 = 2, which is actually identical in meaning to this third equation, right? These two equations both say. So my plea here is for empathy with your readers, right? Because this is what your model looks like to you. You see 1 + 1 = 2, but this is what your model looks like to your readers. You know, AMR now has a policy statement on the use of formal models in AMR publications, which emphasizes the importance of making them accessible to readers. And I've included that document in the folder. I see I'm running out of time if I haven't run out of time completely, but my point here is that don't do this, right? Formalism for the sake of formalism either obscures your message or obscures the fact that you have no message. Either way, it's a bad idea. I have kind of run out of time, so I have a couple more slides, and if we have time later, I'll bring them up. But out of respect for my other panelists, I will shut up and pass the baton to others. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Next, we will have Feng presenting how formal models can contribute to strategy research.
So thanks so much to the organizers for this opportunity, and thanks to everyone who made this session happen. So it's a really great pleasure for me to kind of have the chance to talk about how formal models can contribute to strategy research. So my talk is going to be quite consistent with what Rich has already mentioned, but I'd like to basically highlight two key benefits from formal models, at least to me. Since I do like both empirical research and also modeling research, and I found actually formal models are particularly valuable in these two areas. One is to study outliers or cases where we only have a small number of observations. Now, think about like if you think about our own teaching experience, if you have taught any kind of strategy classes with some cases or with some examples, and we at least in my classes, I tend to like focus a lot on these extremely successful companies like Walmart, Amazon, like Tesla, Apple, Google. Right? Then if you if you think about like this is what you teach, and then compare that to what you do research, right? You actually instantly you can find some inconsistency in the sense that if you have gathered a data set about a particular industry, right? Say retail industry, right? Most likely you are not going to be like doing lots of empirical analysis on companies like Amazon or Walmart in your data set, right? In fact, pretty frequently you will find that Amazon, Walmart, these are actually outliers, right? So the typical way of treating these outliers is to actually drop them, because your goal is to make sure that you can understand the average effect to the population. Your goal is not to kind of identify some effect that has been completely driven by these outliers. So as a result, right, I mean, like I often find that there is this inconsistency between like what I empirical study and what I actually teach, right? Because in class, we want to actually talk about outliers, because these are the companies that have already achieved or sustained like a much greater competitive advantage than their competitors. And we want to actually learn from these outliers, right? So one way actually to learn from these outliers and through academic research is actually to do formal modeling, because if you do modeling, then you are not restricted by the number of observations you have. You can actually uncover lots of learning from just looking at outliers, right? So certainly there are also other approaches, right? For instance, you could also do like an in-depth case method approach, right? So, but the formal modeling and also this case method approach can actually complement each other as well. And the second setting where I find like formal models can be very useful would be study research questions where you actually have some insight, but the data correction could be very difficult, or sometimes it would be almost impossible, but you still want to deliver such insights. So let me actually just show you with two examples from the two of the papers I've written. So one paper is with Ron Edner and Jian Chen and in Mandarin Science on frenemies in platform markets. So our kind of basically motivation from this study really came from this empirical observation, right, in the ebook industry, in which Apple's iPad competes with Amazon's Kindle, right? And Apple has its App Store iBooks, Amazon has its like a basically bookstore Kindle, and they both attract kind of installed base, right, of users. And what's interesting about this industry is that we discovered that Amazon actually also made the Kindle app available on iPad, right? And Apple didn't do that, right? So Apple didn't make iBooks, for instance, on Kindle devices. You would think like this is like a crazy, right? Why would Amazon do that, right? In the sense that if you have the Kindle app on iPad, then who's going to buy the Kindle devices, right? They could just buy iPad and read all the ebooks from Amazon. And isn't this kind of detrimental to Amazon's business, right? And also given that Kindle also competes with iBooks, why would Apple be willing to sacrifice book sales by having Kindle, by allowing Kindle apps in its app store? Then we also look at the kind of across different industries. We found that, okay, this is also taking place like between Android and iOS, in the sense that Google would put like this Google Map application on iOS. And Apple has its own like Apple Maps, but Apple didn't put Apple Maps on Android devices, for instance. And this is also taking place between Microsoft and Apple, in the sense that Microsoft would put all the Office softwares, right, and Word, PowerPoint on iPad or Android devices, right? Even though Microsoft is trying to sell or grow the sales of Surface at the same time to compete with iPad. So we had a few examples, but these examples are not sufficient to run any empirical studies, in the sense that, I mean, one is that within each industry, we only have like one or two examples, and across industry, like we need to control for all these kind of differences across industries if we were to do an empirical study. This is certainly like not feasible for an empirical paper. So we basically first had this motivation, like what motivates competing platform owners to become frenemies, essentially, and choose this asymmetric equivalent of one-way compatibility, essentially, by having like one app compatible with another operating system or platform. And we decided to basically study this question through a modeling approach, right? And then after we modeled this competitive dynamics, we found that actually the insight is actually quite simple in the sense that these two platforms, right? They use, even though they seem to be using the same business model, basically hardware sales, royalty, and but their ways to capture value seem to be quite different, right? In the sense that Apple makes most of the money from hardware sales, and Amazon makes most of the money from content, ebooks. So as a result, right, because of this asymmetry, and it makes sense for Amazon to actually put like it's a Kindle reader on iPad, in the sense that it would grow essentially the book sales, and it would also help Apple grow its hardware sales, which essentially becomes win-win in both cases. And we apply this logic to other settings and found this logic actually works really well. And just as Richard said that, one kind of a key benefit from the modeling work is actually to look for moderators, essentially all these Z factors in this case. So we went on to look at how various factors would affect this compatibility incentives. And we found that actually indeed, right, lots of factors can influence this incentive. And also without formal modeling, it's actually very difficult to basically reason through, right, how these factors will affect this incentives to be friendly. So this is one paper. And as you can see that the reason we wrote this paper is because we had some insight, but we couldn't articulate it through basically empirical work in this case. And Ramon Caceres-Macenel and I had another paper in SMJ talking about the business model innovation and the competitive imitation. And again, this is a case that where we found the empirical approach is actually very difficult. So let me just describe the study a little bit so you can see the difficulty here. So the motivation here again is about the business model innovations can be imitated. And so as a result, if you're a new entrant with some business model innovation, you have to strategically choose whether to compete through this innovation, or maybe it's actually better off for you if you don't use this business model innovation, because if this is being copied, then situation might be even worse, right? You'd rather just use the traditional business model. And so we developed a 3-stage game, right? So incumbent is already there. It uses a traditional business model. Entrant decides its business model. Incumbent learns about the entrant choice, choose a business model to respond. Then they pick the tactical choices such as pricing, etc., to compete. And so what we found from this study is that the entrant indeed sometimes can strategically review or conceal its innovation, in the sense that, okay, sometimes like an entrant has some innovation, it makes sense actually for entrant to review this innovation, even if the incumbent can imitate it. Actually, in fact, right? If the incumbent may not want to imitate it, entrant may not want to review it in this case, because it turns out that in this case, right, by imitating, the incumbent action will actually benefit the entrant. And we also found some cases where the entrant would actually strategically conceal the innovation because of this competitive imitation. And we also found that in some cases that the value of the business model innovation can be so substantial that the incumbent would actually benefit from the existence of an entrant, because the entrant may bring this innovation and the incumbent can imitate and become better off. So as you can see from this study, and if you were to do an empirical study, it's very difficult because secondary data sets won't help, because we are really looking at some innovations that have not been introduced to the industry because of the strategic behavior of the entrant, right? So in order to actually study this issue, you may have to go like a company by company to do interviews to figure out, okay, which business innovation you had in mind before you actually enter the market, and why did you choose A, not B, and which business innovation you try to conceal and why, and you actually have to gather lots of data around this. But when you do the formal modeling, you are not restricted by this, right? So in the interest of the time, I will just share these two stories. And so the idea here is that formal models sometimes can do can allow you to deliver some insights that the empirical papers may not be able to do it very efficiently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Feng. Now we just open the first Q&A session. I've seen several questions, great questions have been posted in the chat window. And the first question raised by Joe Plum, this is really relevant to what Elena and David will talk about. So how about we save your question for later? I will make sure to come back to it. And the second question comes from Leonardo Kluppel. Leo, do you want to speak up for your question?
Yeah, sure. So it's obviously very interesting and important for us to discuss the role of formal models for us as researchers, but I also try to understand what's the role for formal models to practitioners, to manage. Should we try to teach them? One of the things that I think it's important for formal models is when you learn formal models, you learn as if you learn a new language, and then it teaches you how to think the world in different ways. And that teaches how to separate assumptions from the results of your mental models of how the world works. And that might be something important for practitioners. So I'll want to listen from people on the panel, what they think about teaching formal models to practitioners, or should we just understand by ourselves and just share the results? What do you guys think about that?
You're braver than I am. It's not something that I would try, but I guess the question is, what would the purpose be? So maybe.
And I think so. I guess I would say, I think you want to be clear about what you're teaching them. I don't know that there's a value in teaching them to build formal models. Maybe there is, but
yeah, I agree.
But I think helping them to understand, like I certainly use, like I will share formal models in my class and sort of walk them through it, and the smarter ones will maybe follow what's going on. So I mean, I think having them being able to read, understand, consume formal models, I think is useful. I've never tried teaching them how to build one because I can't even teach that to my PhD students. So like MBAs.
Yeah, I agree. In the same way that we have like many empirical models that we don't teach them, but we have we teach them how to think about that in those terms. But yeah, thanks.
So let me just chime in here. It's not exactly the same thing, but I have some actual experience working with practitioners on solving their gender wage gap. And you really can't even use the standard log wage equation. I mean, you can when you actually calculate it, but when you explain it to them, you have to use a regular just dollars on the left and everything. So you're dealing with a very non-technical audience. That's just the issue.
Leo, I just remembered that Mike Ryle, I think, teaches an MBA level course, which is based on coalitional game theory. So maybe he would be able to answer this question better than I could.
Can I just very quickly? So one experience, my own experience was teaching several case studies is one way to that you can convey it is about the importance of comparative statics. So in some sense, cases, like different context settings vary in very similar, but very important ways. And if you actually provide some basic parameters about how that characterize these different settings, and then tell people if you change this parameter, what are the comparative stacks will look like, and that may change how you think about like the choice of different core choices and whether it performs in one setting versus another. So just like the notion of comparative statics can be quite important, and without having to let them know the formal model, etc. But that way of thinking is exactly what I think you said is important.
I would like to address another question from Kathy, and some of the other questions we will save it for the second round. Kathy, can you speak for your question? I find it very interesting.
Sure. I guess I see a lot of modeling papers in various roles that I play, and there seems to be a difference between the types of models that the speakers have spoken about so far, which are models that are actually solved. You develop a model, you solve the model, and the results of the model are used to generate insights. That's very different than setting up a model and using the model just to communicate relationships. And I see those as two very different approaches. And sometimes when folks are using the model in the latter way, they don't realize that that's not solving a model. Folks that are sometimes very new to this type of research will use that, and they're using it to express themselves. And if, those of us who were originally trained as engineers, we'd rather speak in math than in words. It's a lot easier, it's more efficient, it's faster. But I'm just interested in the panelists' thoughts of using modeling in these two different ways. And do you see benefits to using it in an expository manner, as well as the traditional solving the model for insights?
Well, I'll just try to be consistent with what I said earlier, which is that it's about the insight, not about the precision. So if just having the setup of the model is sufficient to generate the insight, then I suppose so, but I'm not sure how deep of an insight that would be. But, if that's enough to generate the insight, go ahead.
I mean, so if I think that Jensen and Meckling 1976 was exactly an example of what you're talking about, Kathy, and it's obviously had an impact. So, that can work. I think it really depends, It's not the same, though. I completely agree.
And,
I think Feng, did you want to say something before?
Oh yeah, so I would just echo what Richard and David said, in the sense that compared to verbal theory, I think if you use some mathematical symbols to set up your logic, I think it will be more precise. But ultimately, the objective is to be able to generate insights, and the insight doesn't have to be generated necessarily by solving equilibrium conditions. Essentially, you could generate lots of insights even through verbal theory, right? Lots of AMR papers they just they use verbal to deliver the theory, and the approach worked pretty effectively. But of course, right? I mean, in some cases, you would think that they might benefit from using some symbols, right? So that mathematically it looks at least more rigorous and make it easier for people to follow.
Well, thank you. I know that one thing, when sometimes I'll see a paper, I'm like, oh, if the author just solved this, we could see so much more. And sometimes it's a matter of skill. Sometimes it's just a matter of what they're trying to accomplish. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, all the panelists, for answering the questions. I see several other great questions, and we will save it for later. And now we're going to move to our second part of the panel. First, Elena will talk about how to develop model, followed by David talking about choosing between the right model. What's the right model? Elena?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Liyue. Also, I want to say that maybe panelists could also answer some of the questions in the chat window, because I think there are I'm really happy to see all this discussion. We may not have time to answer all of them live, but please, maybe you could just answer them in the chat window. Okay, so can you see my screen? Just give me a thumb up. Okay, cool. So I hope at this point, Rich and Feng, in their excellent presentations, have convinced you that formal models are very useful for management research. And I hope that some of you cannot wait to get back to their table, pick a pen and a paper, and start developing a model. And I also hope that my presentation could give you some tips about how to go around that. Now, I think it's not a secret that a lot of people, especially those who do not have a math or econ background, are somehow intimidated by the idea of developing a formal model, mainly because it has a lot of Greek letters and weird symbols. And in general, what many people say is that I'm not going to develop a model because math is so complicated. But actually, in many models, what you really need to do, you just need to maximize a function given some constraint, and you just need to take a derivative and solve a couple of equations or inequalities. So even though math may seem scary, once you do have your equations to solve, it does not have to be too complicated. The problem, however, is how do you get to those equations? And this can be a stumbling block. Like, so what do you put in the model? What are the so-called moving parts, the interesting things about your model? And when I had to do this the first time, my reaction was, oh, where do I even start? Now, models do have some common elements. So here I put a suggestions of the things that you may consider asking yourself when you start doing a formal model. So first, who are the players in the model? Is it a single firm? Maybe competing firms, maybe have a whole supply chain there. Secondly, what are the goals of these players, or what we call it objective functions? Most firms seek to maximize profits, but there could be some other goals, or you may have a government or a non-profit who wants to maximize the welfare. Then you need to understand what are the decisions or strategic actions that these players can take. This is exactly when you get into these interesting moving parts. And this is something that normally stems from your research question or the phenomenon that you are studying or theory that you want to contribute to. And it could be anything. Maybe it's about investment or market entry or alliance. It could be anything. And as you think about those decisions or actions, usually there is some kind of timeline associated with these decisions. Very rarely models happen at one point in time. So at the most basic level, you can have a situation where the firm invests first, and then the outcomes are revealed and the firms compete in the market. And the fifth important element, the fifth element is that you must have some trade-offs in this model. If there is no trade-off, the model is not interesting. You just have one straight line, you just do a lot of this and you'll be better off. It's not interesting to modelers, and it's also won't be interesting probably to strategy scholars. So there has to be some trade-off. Again, at the most basic level, an action can entail a cost. So cost could be your trade-off. Or maybe there is uncertainty. You enter first when uncertainty is high, but there is less competition, or you wait when it's resolved, but there is more competition. But there must be a trade-off in the model. So when you start doing a formal model, you think about research question, and then you think about these elements, and you need to make choices about each of these elements. Once you have these choices, you will need to translate them into modeling language, and modeling language means math. So how do you do that? Now, when I was thinking about this presentation, I thought about kind of my own experience working with different formal models, and I realized that actually I've been following two different ways to model. And I just want you to be clear on this. I'm talking about the early draft, not the version that you submit to the publisher. This is how you start doing a model from scratch. So one way to do this could be what I call from theory, which basically means you have some existing formal models and you realize that maybe there is some assumption that you want to change or do something else, and then they can get some interesting incentives. So this is something that I did with my co-author, Olivier Chatan, in our SMJ paper. There is a whole class of value-based models. They talk about vertical supply chain relationships, and our question was, what happens if we add a non-profit actor into the mix? So in this case, the good thing is that you know the starting point. These are the existing formal models, and you probably have some general idea of the ending point. At the very least, you probably have some idea that the outcomes will be different, because if the outcomes are the same, then it's not interesting. So how do you start? Very easy. You take the existing model, we call it workhorse models, and then you add your tweaks on this model. Like for instance, what we did, we added a new player, a nonprofit, or maybe you say, I changed the assumption, or the actors care about something else now. Now, this is a good way to start, but the problem can be that maybe you're interested in a certain phenomenon or a certain management or strategy theory, but you don't immediately see the formal models on that topic or formal models that you could use. So this was what happened to me in my second actual project. I want to model an ecosystem, and I could not immediately find something that would reflect the setup that I had in mind. And in that case, I call it modeling from phenomenon. So the problem here is that you don't have the starting point, but you probably have some verbal idea of the ending point, something that is interesting for you in this phenomenon. So in this case, what I found to be useful is simply modeling directly whatever you see. I said, okay, I have to ecosystem orchestrators. Hey, firm A, firm B, and there are 6 complementers. Well, there's XYZ firms, and they have this number of products. Now, obviously, when you start doing that, very quickly you realize that you need to simplify. Maybe I don't need to have 6 complementers. I need to have only 1. I don't need to have 5 products for firm A and 13 products for firm B. Maybe there are just 2 products, a wide audience product and a niche product. So as you start doing these simplifications, at some point you will realize that your model actually resembles something. So you'll figure out that there is some workhorse model. For instance, for me, I realized that actually it becomes a horizontal differentiation model, which is widely available. And at this point, there is a process of going back and forth between the workhorse model and the phenomenon. So you have complexity of the phenomenon, and you have the tractability and simplicity of the model. And at some point, the 2 will converge. That's where you get a first draft. Now, actually, independently of which way you are choosing, you kind of do end up having a bit of both. Even if you start from a prior formal model, very often it's the phenomenon that informs you about what are the tweaks that you should put in this model. When you start modeling from the phenomenon, at some point you will figure out what's the workhorse model, what are the models that are similar to yours, so you will leverage them. And by the way, I just want to tell, especially to those who are non-modelers, the workhorse model does not necessarily have to be on the same research question as yours. It can be from something else. Like I got my inspiration from a paper on government versus firms doing social services. The point is the features and the setup that are familiar. Now, a few tips about what happens when you have your first draft. First, keep it very simple. Just get something that's interesting enough to be shared with somebody else. Have something that's solvable and tractable. And the thing with a formal model is that you can always add complications later. And the second very important thing is that you need to understand what are the mathematical mechanisms behind your findings. Like for instance, okay, thanks, Liyue. So, you have this fancy 4 zones graph. Understand what drives them. Is it because you had this fancy function for profits with a square root and a couple of logarithms, and that's why you have all those areas? Or is it something about the actions that firms take and those trade-offs? Also, really, you have to trace how the assumptions that you made drove these results, how they are related, and does it make sense in the real world? And this is very important. A formal model should not be a black box to you. This is what helps you understand if it's realistic, and it helps you understand what are the strategic implications, which is, by the way, why you need to keep it simple. So I would like to conclude with a few words on what do you need to know where to start. And I think there was actually a question in the chat about that. I try to make it sound like anyone can do formal modeling. It's very accessible, but of course you need to have some knowledge and skills background. So in terms of knowledge, okay, you need to be able to do derivatives and integrals to solve the model. Industrial organization is also very important. It will help you understand the jargon of the field, and it's a great source of established workhorse models. So highly recommend reading a textbook on industrial organization. And get some knowledge of game theory. Not all, but most strategy models are game theoretic. And when you do a decision tree, even if it doesn't make into a final paper, it's a great way to think about the outcomes and what firms can do to push to more favorable outcomes. And in terms of skills, unfortunately, there is no textbook formal modeling 101. But what is very useful is to understand how other people made choices about model setup. And then it helps you to understand how to make those choices yourself. So read existing formal model papers. Don't focus on the math, but focus on the underlying logic and assumptions. See how they pass from research question to the model. Also helps to break the psychological barrier and fear of formal modeling. And another useful exercise could be trying to replicate a formal model paper. So you look at the research question and then think, how would I model that? And you can go back and forth, see what the authors did, and try to then think what, based on that, you would do next. So with this, I conclude. It will take time, but remember, it's a long road, it's a cumulative process, and it's also actually fun to do that. So I stopped sharing at this point, and David actually did us a huge favor, and he recorded a video of his presentation. So I can actually share. So I know, do you want to share itself, or I can otherwise share your link?
So why don't I try doing it from my computer, because then it doesn't have to come from YouTube and then go out into the world. So it's one less server that has to pass through. That's the plan, but I'm going to put into chat a link to the YouTube video. It's unlisted, so you need to use this link. I haven't made it public yet. And we'll see if this works. And I'll just say to preface this that I am assuming no prior, wait, I'm off camera, no prior knowledge, where's my hand go, of cooperative and non-cooperative game theory here. So this is going to be at a very, very high level. First talking about what those two things are. And it's only 9 minutes and 59 seconds long, so I've shortchanged you a second. Please, no hate. Okay, so here we go. Okay, folks, so it's my pleasure to be at this symposium and talk about how to choose between cooperative and non-cooperative models. Here is a paper. My eyes are getting old. I can't quite make out the author, but I hear it is just an instant classic, which talked about how to use game theory and strategy, and also how to choose between cooperative and non-cooperative models. So I will draw heavily on this paper, and you don't have to read this paper, but please make sure that you do cite it extensively. So first of all, what is non-cooperative game theory? Well, you may have seen the movie A Beautiful Mind about John Nash, who literally did invent non-cooperative game theory, and you can explain it like this. Imagine that Rich Makadok and I each own a company in a market, and we're playing a game, a pricing game, where we pick a price. What would be a Nash equilibrium in that game? Well, imagine a pair of prices, one for him and one for me. Can he do, given the price that I'm charging, can he do any better by changing his price to something else? If the answer is no, then we flip the question around. Given the price that he is charging, can I do any better, make more profits by changing my price to something else, higher or lower? If the answer is no for both of us, or for every player in a game with more than 2 players, that is a Nash equilibrium. If you think about it, it sounds a little bit like a fixed point, and mathematically, that's exactly what it is. So John Nash, as I said, invented this way back in the 1950s. What we subsequently learned is that a lot of the classic economic models that you've probably learned about, like quantity competition with Cournot or price competition with Bertrand, were in fact non-cooperative games. We just didn't realize it at the time. As incredibly productive as this game theoretic, mostly industrial organization and macroeconomic work was back in the 70s and 80s, as I think my friend, co-author, and all-around great scholar, Rich Makadok, probably told you in his own presentation, how do I know that? How do I can see the future? They did run out of all the low-hanging fruit. However, there was another tradition which perhaps has become very important in strategy, and that's cooperative game theory. What is cooperative game theory, though? Well, first of all, cooperative is a terrible name, so forget that. It's more a matter of saying, if we have a pie to slice up, if we have value, profit, something to cut up among a group of people, how do we think that's likely to happen? Can we design a set of rules that will explain how the value gets apportioned to individual people? And what would matter? Well, it might matter how much individual subgroups, they're called coalitions, could make if they were to say, hey, we're not playing along with the whole group, the grand coalition, rather we're going to go off on our own. To give you a sense of what that means, let's consider an example. So have a look at my shirt. Of course, you know these young women, they are Blackpink, one of the most successful groups in the world in the field of music. Not as big as BTS, but very, very big. And here we have Jennie, Rosé, Jisoo, and Lisa. So this group is creating a lot of value, including financial value. They're very talented. They can sing, they can dance, they speak multiple languages, including Korean and English. They have a very well-defined brand image, and they're very successful. So obviously, the grand coalition of all 4 of them together creates a lot of value, making a lot of money in this context. How would they divide it? Well, one thing that may be relevant, and you may know this about K-pop, yes, this is K-pop, is that frequently subgroups of the larger group will record songs or tour on their own. It could be just 2 of them, it could be 3 of them, or it could be just 1. So as you can see, Jenny's very, very talented. She speaks English fluently, and in addition to being, of course, a native speaker of Korean, she can sing and she can rap and she can dance. Kind of meta that her one big solo song is called Solo Feet Nanin Solo. But point is, if she has this option, some of the rules that in cooperative game theory, especially the core, will attach a lot of value to that. Say, hey, you know, you're going to have to give her a lot of value from the Grand Coalition, or she could go off on her own and just make her own music. So of all these CGT solution concepts or rules, the core is the one that's had the biggest influence on the field of strategy, at least if you measure it by how much it's been used. So let's talk a little bit about why that is. Not too long ago, this is a relatively recent thing, Brandenburger and Stewart, in a series of papers, some of which they co-authored and some of which Stewart wrote in his own, essentially invented a formal framework that it is said was intended to mimic Porter's 5 forces, but in a mathematically rigorous way. How do I know that that was their intention when it's not explicitly written down anywhere?
It is known. It is known.
Folks, just take my word for it. That's what the intention was. So the way a bioform game works is that there is an NGT stage, which is meant to mimic the market structuring activities that are involved in a focal company developing a competitive position vis-a-vis its suppliers, its buyers, barriers to entry, other companies it competes with, and so on. And what are market structuring activities? I don't know, they could be differentiation, investments in competencies, you know, investments in product development, all that stuff. And then there would be a subsequent cooperative game theoretic stage using the core that would then take whatever value was around and apportion it between the firm and its various buyers and suppliers and so on. So how do you choose between these, you know, non-cooperative game theory, cooperative game theory, and so on? Well, there are both substantive aspects and aspects more related to taste. Substantively, non-cooperative game theory, because it's a very specific way of modeling interaction, is good if you want to model a very specific situation. If you want to model retailers posting a price which consumers take or leave, that sounds a lot like Bertrand. If you want to model a situation where farmers make a certain quantity of grapefruit, it's up to them, and take it to market, and based on that quantity, some, you know, vegetables or fruit seller, you know, establishes a market clearing price, well, that sounds like Cournot. If you want to model auctions, then you might want to use an auction model, right? However, in the field of strategy, we frequently think that we're modeling fundamental forces of nature as relates to value creation and value capture. And that's why I think we have a fondness for cooperative game theory, because it makes less specific rules that might affect your results and mean that they only apply in certain situations. It's more a general solution, if you like. But as a famous hyena once said, be prepared, because even the CGT rules do have bite. They come, you know, they imply different things, as I now explain, by returning to our Blackpink example. So this is the Blackpink house. Jenny has just cooked a meal for the other girls. And I mean, just, it's reality TV, folks, so that means, by definition, it's real. And look at how they get along and they all like each other. I mean, you don't really think they're going to engage in like hard bargaining. They're going to use something like maybe the nucleolus that tries to minimize the degree to which any single one of them would feel deprived, right? I mean, come on, how could it be any other way? Two more things. We don't use dynamic analytic models that much in strategy, but if you do use one, you're going to have to use non-cooperative game theory, because cooperative game theory really hasn't been developed yet for those situations. And finally, for a variety of reasons, the Biform model, as originally proposed by Brandenburger and Stewart, has become something of a standard. Doesn't mean you can't deviate from it, but reviewers may say, hey, do you have a good reason for not doing this as a standard Biform model? And so be prepared for those kinds of comments. And if you're really interested, of course, then you can get really, really deeply into it and start taking game theory courses. And oh no, nani mi mali wabaryanangal, anase modinge chan nani anangal, and you'll become addicted to formal modeling, just like the rest of us. Bye.
Delightful.
Thank you, David.
Delightful.
That was great. I would like to ask Ingo to address his or her questions. Would you like to speak up for that?
Sure, I had two. I guess I'm going to ask the one which is a little bit less open and provocative. So my question was, do you see overall a value in standardizing a knowledge canon by using formal model, as it happens in economics, for example? Or do you see a downside of doing so in that, well, some of the stuff then becomes very restricted? In other words, for the strategy field, would you see more formalization or would you prefer less formalization? Thank you.
So, I mean, this is just my view, but I would say at this point, I would say more formalization is probably useful, right? Because I think part of the value of these models is also to just provide us with a common basis for talking to each other, right? So I think we have a lot of concepts that are called different things in different subsets of the literature, and I think models can be helpful. I don't think we want to go as far as right? So I mean, again, I think it's a S-curve adoption model, right? Like you need to start by sort of doing a little bit more formalization. I don't think we want to go as far as economics. I think we want to be mindful. But I mean, at this point, I think we're very far from the risk of, making things so rigid that nobody can kind of do anything real. I don't see that happening anytime soon, right? So
I would add that, maybe in the field, like if you look at the strategy field, there are lots of different approaches to formal modeling. I mean, you could, some people even use some simulation, right? NK models, that's also a possibility. But at the individual level, I would strongly advocate some specialization in the sense that each method takes a long time to to learn and actually become comfortable, or learn everything you need actually to be at the cutting edge, so that you could actually write papers using that methodology. So at the individual level, I would say that you probably don't want to try to use a variety of methods in formal modeling. You stick to with like one or maybe at most like two methods, and really hone your skill sets well enough so that you can actually write papers about these methods. Yeah.
And I think that another thing that kind of prevents us from going all the way to economics is that we're an applied field. And that's related to another question that was asked, is we always have this grounding on trying to get our research and make it very relevant for managers, for CEOs, for employees, so on and so forth. So that kind of makes it harder for us to go all the way into what economics went and spiral down onto this, models that are highly formalized, but maybe in terms of insights, they get like less and less insights. Yeah.
So, okay, I think at this point we will pass the torch to Feng. So,
that's a very tough act to follow, David. Thank you, the organizers, for this opportunity, and it's really nice opportunity to see some friends in the audience, both in the audience and on the panel. It's a great pleasure to talk a little bit about my own experience. I'm mainly an empirical researcher, and I'm not a formal modeler. I probably can, talking about specialization that Feng says, like I can probably only make one type of model, which is basically a single decision maker model, which is in a way just a way to formalize trade-offs, like costs and benefits. I have like my job market paper that I spent way more time than any other paper. That is the only one that I have a game theory. There's like 2 players in it, but for almost any other model. It's a very simple single decision maker model. So in some sense, it's not too difficult if you can find a way to formalize costs and benefits. So I'll just talk through several main benefits and value that I have personally found in my own research. And it's likely to be a little bit abstract because 10 minutes is not enough to talk through them in light of concrete examples, so that later in the breakout section, I'm happy to talk a bit more and put them into greater context. So the first thing is not surprising to all is from an empirical researcher's point of view, an important value of modeling is really your force to simplify, because data and phenomenon can be immensely complex, and you've got to start from somewhere, and also you've got to have, for you and for the sake of your readers, to have a map to sort of provide a clearer story of your narrative. And related to that, one potential benefit about simplification is that it helps you clarify the trade-offs that the particular decision makes, both inside as well as outside the model. The reason I say that is often from a decision, for example, take the sort of example of an innovator. For a particular innovator, what type of sort of projects he or she decides to invest in, etc., may depend on many different reasons and many factors. And you cannot model all of them, because otherwise it will be like immensely complex very quickly. So in that sense, you probably have to force yourself to, to boil down to the most essential factors. And usually, for example, sometimes asymmetric information is more important in certain settings, while uncertainty is more important in other settings. And you probably have to make a decision. And that probably depends on, and preferably depends on your observation about this particular institutional context. And to a great extent also depends on sort of what kind of measures you can actually, what kind of factors you can actually empirically measure in a convincing way. Verbal theory can help you do that, but can be more difficult, as many of the panelists already mentioned. What I like the most about having a model is what I call the importance of secondary predictions. As hinted by several of the questions in the chat already, I think primary prediction, meaning like the main prediction of a model, is actually quite straightforward. And often in many models you see, the assumptions are already to a great extent built in. So deriving the primary prediction that fits the average result or main result of your data is not terribly difficult, or it's useful, but it's limited. What I think is very important is having a model will help you derive further predictions, what I call secondary predictions, that can so that you can take those secondary predictions, like comparative statics or heterogeneous effects or conditional effects, etc. You can take those predictions to the other aspects or the other aspects of your data. So in that way, it both provides a sort of guidance for you to empirically, to know how to empirically explore your data, but at the same time provides greater confidence about your model. And sometimes it also provides some surprising predictions that, so that you can be more confident about some of the surprising findings of your data. You may sometimes just discard and don't know how to explain, but with a model, you can actually be more confident that it comes from a solid logical path. And another important use of secondary predictions is that it helps you differentiate among competing theories. Sometimes 2 or 3 multiple theories or stories may actually give you the same primary prediction, but then they are likely to provide you with contrasting or opposite secondary predictions. And that's one way for you to actually take it to the data and help you differentiate among the theory, different potential stories. And the next thing, another thing that I really like about formal modeling is that it is put the mechanism front and center. So one thing I really like about the process of thinking through what the decision maker might be thinking about is to have a better understanding about the data generating process. And this is very important because often clean identification is very difficult or almost impossible in many empirical research in strategy field. So many of my papers, especially the early ones, lack good empirical identification strategies. And so in that case, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't write up the papers. It just means that you probably need to work a bit harder to actually try to figure out what could be the underlying mechanisms underlying these identified patterns, and providing sort of a micro foundation about the basic trade-offs and exactly through what mechanisms the different pieces of the data might be generated is an important way for you to actually clarify what could be plausible mechanisms for your data. And of course, often it is the case that you cannot completely rule out every single alternative mechanisms. And having a model and having sort of a few essential factors clearly spelled out may actually help you differentiate, sort of help you like figure out more clearly a couple of mechanisms that your model actually cannot readily differentiate. So in that case, making that point clear is also very important as part of the paper, and it's important to both the reviewers as well as the readers. So many people have talked about the importance of boundary conditions and external validity, which is, I think it is important, extremely important, and particularly important for empirical research, because many of the, at least like all of my own papers are based on a particular setting. And then the question about how generalizable your results are, or whether applied to other settings is one important part of the discussion. So having one important consequence of having a formal model is, again, it allows you to do comparative statics. And the ability to do comparative statics helps you figure out sort of under what conditions your results are likely to hold or likely to be more salient versus under other conditions where your results may not hold. For example, in my, again, like in my job market paper, where there were actually the only model where there were two players, the key result, that is the non-monotonicity result, only, at least in light of my model, only happens when you actually have the seller and the buyer at the same time, and only happen if the evaluation cost of the buyer for early stage ideas is sufficiently important. If you don't have that condition, you will not have the non-monotonous result. You want to have a monotonic result. So that kind of comparative statics, or that kind of result predictions, will help you make a sort of more informative boundary conditions kind of discussion. For example, in my setting, which is screenplayers selling screenplays, then sort of reading a screenplay is relatively sort of, the cost of evaluating a screenplay is relatively important relative to the value of the screenplay, relative to the biotech industry, for example. The due diligence cost relative to the potential value of like a breakthrough drug is probably relatively trivial in that sense. So then, like, one way I can like discuss in my paper is then the sort of this model or this non-monotonic result per se may not hold in settings where the evaluation costs are not particularly important. The next point I want to discuss is, I often get this question about, like, what is the sequence? Like, did you set up the model first and then carry them with predictions to the data, or do you actually look at the data first and then try to find a way to set up your model so that like it derive predictions that are consistent with the data?
Sorry, Feng, just like, this is 1 minute left, please.
Yes, yes. I'll be done by 1 minute. I think the key point is that I think it is an iterative process. The worst practice is that you contrive your set up your model or assumptions so that you can fit the data. But to have the right data model set up, you need to understand the institutions extremely well, and it's hard for you to understand the institutional details and your data extremely well at the very beginning. So inevitably, you will need sort of iteration process so that you can be more informed in setting up your assumptions that are well motivated empirically. And related to this question, where do you present your data? So I have various different papers that present, it depends. I have various different papers that present the model both at the front and in the middle or at the end. It depends on, for example, whether the theoretical insights is the thing that you really want to highlight, or you just want the model to actually help the reader and yourself to provide a rationalization, provide a narrative and a story to underpin your main results. So in that case, I have a couple of examples where I put it at the end rather than at the front. Or in the end, you realize that the model may not be completely necessary. You can put it in the appendix, but having a model can still be quite useful to provide a more rigorous discussion of the tension and the trade-offs at the front end. So finally, I just want to say, beware of the limitations. In particular, sometimes having a model can be quite restrictive in the sense you really want to make the model work. So that is not a good situation. So I want to say, I want to end at the point that model is not a substitute for good questions, valuable insights, or solid empirical execution. That's all.
So thank you very much, Feng, for a great presentation. So we have our final panelist, Aseem. So please, Aseem, go on.
Okay. Everybody see my screen and hear me okay? Thanks, Elena.
Yes.
Okay, so I was asked to provide thoughts on future opportunities for formal models based on my own experience, which presumably meant I would need to know what my experiences in the future are going to be, so I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do is talk about what I see as some opportunities with one important caveat. I don't think of myself as a modeler, right? Of course, I have a lot less gray hair than Rich does, so I also have far fewer papers. In fact, I have actually exactly one paper that only got published because Rich accepted it. That is actually a formal modeling paper, right? I have one other simulation paper. What I have a lot of, though, in the spirit of Hong's presentation, is these papers that I think of as models plus, where the model, there's somewhere hidden away in one corner of the paper, there's a model. But the other thing I want to highlight is, even in those papers, only one of those 5 papers actually started off with a model. Like the initial submission had a model. In 4 other cases, the model got added in the review process, and I really don't think the paper would have got published without the addition of that model. Sometimes the reviewers asked for it, sometimes the editors asked for it. A couple of times it just seemed useful. I say all that to make the point that, my perspective on this is I don't see modeling as particularly an end in itself. I think consistent with some of the comments we've already heard, I think of it as a tool that, one among many tools that helps to make your research, well, importantly better, but also, especially if you're a PhD student or junior faculty, more publishable. The two don't necessarily go together, right? Something can be better and less publishable. But in this case, I think, the two things are reasonably well aligned, both because, it allows you to provide richer insights. I know it says increase rigor, but, I think rigor in the service of better insights, showing you relationships you would not have thought about before, coming up with novel predictions that you can then take to the data and test. But also, and this connects to Kathy's earlier point, as an expository tool, right? So just providing clarity and being able to really transparently communicate what it takes, what you're saying. Of course, it requires a sympathetic editor, but sympathetic editors fortunately are in increasing supply in our field, right? I mean, just look at this panel. I think you've got about 6-7 people who are potential editors for modeling papers. So my core thesis, kind of building on those two ideas, is okay. So that's what models do well. They deliver new insight and they help to communicate that insight more clearly. Where are they more useful? I'm going to argue. I'm not going to talk about a particular modeling technique or a particular area. I'm going to argue that there are three common problems we encounter quite often in strategy theory, and I think models are uniquely well positioned to solve these three problems. Not to say, again, to Rich's point earlier, that you can't solve them in verbal theory, but I think they do a much better job. And I say that to make the point that anytime you find yourself encountering one of these problems, whatever question you're dealing with, whatever area you're doing research on, I want you to think about the possibility of turning that into an opportunity to think about formalizing your theory and bringing stronger theory to bear through formal models. Okay, so what are these problems? One we've already talked about a little bit, right, which is this kind of moving parts problem. So the idea that pretty much everything we study is complex and interdependent, and that's important, right? We want to understand these interdependencies. We want to think about the complex nature of these relationships. But once you start going down that road, verbal theory very quickly kind of runs out of steam. With two-way interactions, it's already hard enough. With three-way interactions, it's pretty much impossible. So I get a lot of papers in my role as editor which have some version of a three-way interaction or have some version of an interaction and a nonlinear effect. Like there's a U-shape, but then there's an interaction on the U-shape. And verbal theory simply does not cut it, right? I mean, to tell a story with a three-way interaction with verbal theory, you have to be able to picture a four-dimensional space in your head. And I mean, maybe I'm just stupid, but I can't do that. So I think models are great for settings where we want to really think about how different things interact, both because they allow you to do that more vigorously, but also because they help you to communicate. So I'm going to use an example. I'm going to shamelessly use my own examples, which everybody else has done anyway. So I'm going to use an example from a paper I wrote with Brian Wu, right? So we were thinking about the effect of a firm's capabilities and its likelihood of being acquired. We actually wrote a whole verbal theory, and our theory said, well, it depends on whether their capabilities are greater or less than the potential acquirers, and whether they're in the same market or existing market. And then that very rapidly got super complicated. So we built a very, very simple model. I mean, this is like, I think 3 parameters, 4 assumptions or something, that gives you this picture you see on, let me see if this works, yep. That gives you this picture on the left, right, which says that's the relationship between capability and the likelihood of being acquired that comes out of our model. The picture on the right is the actual empirical finding from the model, right? So it's this is what we find. It doesn't look quite the same, but it's actually pretty close, right? Except for this little spike at the inflection point, you get more or less the same relationship, right? So without having to explain to you any of the sort of details of the assumptions, I can very clearly sort of show you what the relationship should look like and what the relationship actually looks like if our theory is correct. And this all comes out of one coherent theory. We don't have to sort of make, we don't have to, for every hypothesis, add like 5 pages of text. The other problem, and this relates to boundary conditions, but I think it's bigger than that, is mixed findings, right? So it is a fact universally acknowledged that everything in our field has mixed findings, right? If there's more than 2 papers, there's mixed findings in the prior literature. And that's it's a feature, not a bug, right? It's not surprising. You would think social phenomena would vary depending on the context, but it makes writing the sort of traditional hypothesis-driven papers verbal theory relies on very difficult, because of course you have to derive a hypothesis, you have to make an assumption. Pretty much any assumption you make, reviewers are going to come back and say, well, there's 15 papers that show the opposite. How are you making that assumption? And then it forces you to make these broad claims about generalizability that frankly not to be true, right? It's not going to work outside your context, but you still have to pretend that it does. And so I think an alternative is to really use formal models, not to use hypotheses, but to use models to say, okay, we're going to map assumptions to different predictions. So this is an example from a paper that Jiao and I wrote with our PhD student, where we were thinking about philanthropy as a form of reputation insurance. This paper has no hypotheses. It just has a very, very simple, actually the model is at this point pretty much in the appendix. But from the model, we say, okay, depending on what assumptions you make about the nature of society and the nature of firms, you get different equilibria, right? So we can solve the model and derive 4 different equilibria under 4 different assumptions. We're not saying one of those assumptions will always hold. We're saying let's go, and those equilibria correspond to discriminating empirical predictions. So we can go test in our context which of these assumptions seems to hold, and which relationship actually do we actually find. As it turns out, we find equilibrium 3, which happens to be conveniently for us the most surprising. But anyway, but the point is, one, this doesn't force us to claim, this is completely generalizable to every other context. It allows us to contextualize our theory. It also allows us to potentially reconcile our theory with other findings, saying, well, in other contexts, you might find different results. In fact, in the moderators, in the sort of ex post supplementary analysis in this paper, we actually show that in some contexts you find different results. But we can explain those different results using the same theory, right? So we don't have to say, well, our theory leads to only one set of predictions. It leads to different predictions under different assumptions. And I think there is a growing appetite for papers that move beyond the sort of standard hypothesis testing approach to thinking about how to write papers. The third problem is what I'm going to call the what about B problem, right? So in a lot of our strategy theory, we think about a focal actor, and we think about the entire theory from the focal actor's perspective. We don't really think about, we sort of assume everybody else is kind of passive or compliant or has no agency whatsoever. And that's obviously a problem, right? Because in almost every situation, there are other parties who might react to whatever you happen to do, right? There's alliances, there's alliance partners who have to agree to stuff. If it's acquisitions, there are acquirers and targets, and they have to agree. There's competitors, there's buyer suppliers, there's regulators, etc. Depending on what area you work in, there's always other actors. And trying to, again, not to say you can't do verbal theory where you think about multiple actors' perspectives, but it very rapidly becomes quite difficult, right? So think about the comparative dynamics literature, which is trying to think about competition, right? It's an incredibly clunky set of papers that barely manage to get past, one sequential move and counter move between 2 players in verbal theory, and they sort of throw up their hands and say, that's all we can manage. Models allow us to do much, much better, right? They allow us to think very carefully about the equilibrium conditions. They allow us to model incentives of different actors and make sure that everybody's kind of incentives are being met. They allow us to do, again, I know Elena has some work on this, and I know Olivia has done a bunch of work thinking about matching. So, I think there's tremendous potential to think about these contexts where there are multiple different agents who are sort of interacting with each other with different objective functions and different incentives, and to bring all that together. Elena, how am I doing time?
Yeah, Aseem, I would say like 1 minute. You asked me to give you warning.
Yeah, okay. So just to give you an example of what that looks like, right? And this is actually from the same paper, but hey, I'm not a modeler. What can I do? So that paper builds off a sort of prior paper that talks about, there's kind of this idea that philanthropy can be a form of insurance, and the sort of naive version of that is, well, the more philanthropy you do, the more you're protected if bad things happen. And our starting point in that paper was really to say, well, that doesn't actually make sense. That's not how insurance markets work. If you pay a larger deductible, you should also be paying a larger copay, because the fact that you're paying a deductible signals that you are a bad type actor, right? So when you change the assumption from society is just passive to society is actually paying attention, you get exactly the opposite prediction from the prediction in the prior literature. And so again, I think there's value to thinking about some of these comparative interactions. So overall, I think my message here is, I think there's tremendous opportunity in a wide variety of fields. Pretty much everywhere that you encounter one of these 3 problems, you should think about doing at least some kind of simple formalization, and hopefully we'll see much more of this kind of work going forward. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Aseem. It was a great presentation. So at this point, okay, we are kind of running slightly over time, so we will have only time for 1 question. And so there was a question from Ekin, which I think was really great about the unexpected results. And I know that Jiao answered, but I think it's worthwhile really to have it for all panelists. So Ekin, could you please say your question?
Okay, yeah. Thanks, first of all, for the panelists and the presentation. It's really great to hear a lot about theory. Yeah, my question was about this emergent results, in a sense that when we're setting up models, we might know where it's going to go, or we might want to make it to go the way we expect them to go or want them to go. But if we are kind of building models which have emergent results, as in like complex systems perspective, then we might not even be able to predict ourselves while setting up the model. And kind of my question is, how important is it to have this emergent results, and in terms of value of the theory or the work or insights and so on?
So I think the important thing in my mind is whether you can explain the emergent results after the fact, right? So I think it is tremendously valuable to find a result that actually goes against the sort of standard intuition, either yours or other people's. But it's only useful if you can explain after the fact, especially in sort of simulations or computational models, why is that happening, right? I mean, I think the papers would say, well, we find this result and, you know, sometimes it goes the other way, but we have no idea why. Or, and when I say explain, I mean, not just kind of explain why it happens, but whether the sort of assumptions that drive that are sort of reasonable, right? So, and the same thing applies, by the way, even if you are doing this in empirical work, right? So again, I mean, Hong touched on this a little bit. It's certainly been my experience. Sometimes you come up with predictions that go the exact opposite of what you thought would happen, and then you say, well, that's not what our model shows. But in the subset of observations where those assumptions most likely hold, that is what our assumption model shows, right? So again, you're discovering new interactions through some of these processes.
So in my own experience writing modeling papers, and typically before I put down a model, I have a sense of some expected results. Yeah, I mean, at least like the baseline result, I would have some expectation. It's almost like when you develop a theory on your empirical hypothesis. Most likely you have the hypothesis already, then you go backward and try to develop a theory to support it. Because otherwise, if you don't have like any kind of intuition about how the result would look like, it's actually very difficult to put down a formal model, in the sense that you need to kind of essentially, I mean, the assumptions will drive the model essentially, right? You need to put down the right assumptions and make sure you capture the right forces in the model. But as Aseem also mentioned, that it would be actually very nice if you can discover some results later on, saying that actually, right, beyond what you have expected, these are the kind of unexpected delights. And oftentimes, I think, if I can discover something new beyond my own expectation, I often think that that paper is going to sell really well in the end, right? Because if I didn't expect this result even before I started modeling it, then that basically means that the formal model has its value beyond like basically verbal or just kind of intuition-based reasoning. Yeah. So that's actually very useful. That itself actually serves a test whether the paper is ready for submission. Because if you discover something new, right, regardless whether it's a counterintuitive opposite direction or whether it's just something beyond formal model. Yeah, and that's actually important to look for.
But I do want to emphasize what like Aseem talked about in terms of empirical relevance. So if it is like extremely counterintuitive, but not empirically relevant, not like relevant for the mainstream, but like even you can't find even like a single empirical example to support or consistent with your result, then probably is not particularly very valuable or particularly impactful. Then you probably have to go back to your model assumption and see whether it's driven by some obscure or unreasonable assumptions. But other than that, like, yeah, it would be great if it's both empirically relevant and ex ante non-obvious.
I think you also have to be careful. Just remember that these are moving targets. So if I told you that debt was tax deductible, And that we had relatively complete markets and financial securities, and therefore you should have a firm with 100% debt and one equity share. And if debt wasn't tax deductible, it didn't matter what your capital structure was. That is actually an old hat result that everyone with a finance PhD knows. It's like a classic formal theory, and everyone's used to it, and they know all the reasons why. But in the early 60s, when that first came out, people were so incredibly shocked, and to the point of being angry and rejecting it, and that was the most ridiculous thing they'd ever heard. And there's many, many, many examples of that. So it also depends on the priors of someone. If you show your modeling paper to someone who works a lot with your particular area, agency theory, or dynamic models in macro, whatever it is you do, they're going to see things that are some results that blow other people away are going to seem more straightforward to them. So I agree with what everyone said about the value of surprises, and also that they be relevant, but you also have to remember different audiences are going to react different ways to the same result.
Okay, so I think at this point we can slowly start to go to the breakout session. So first, I would really love to thank everybody for coming. A huge thanks to all the panelists. So, okay, I'm just saying in the order on the screen: Jiao, Rich, Leo, Feng, Hon, David, and Aseem. Huge thanks to all of you for providing wonderful insights and having a great discussion. So also, regarding to earlier question about how to learn, at Virtual SMS, there will be another PDW organized by Olivier Chatan, also on formal modeling. So those of you who are interested about that, you can stay tuned.
Oh no, nani mi mali wabaryanangal, anase modinge chanani anangal, and you'll become addicted to formal modeling, just like the rest of us. Bye.